welcome back to a Sappho Academic. We got another debunked video on Thomas Sowell. I'm going to be going in on Thomas Sowell for quite a bit of videos, and the reason is because Thomas Sowell keeps coming up as a source of information from the manosphere. Specifically, Kim and Samuels looked up to Thomas Sowell, and now we're hearing about just Pearly things repeating what Thomas Sowell was teaching, specifically her comments about enslavement being embellished and being used to control people. So I'm going to demonstrate how Thomas Sowell cherry picks information as an economist because he's not really a historian. He only looks at history from a white conservative Republican point of view and using it as a weapon to go against liberals. But I'm going to demonstrate how he cherry picks information and leaves out information. And this is why you have to be not even academically educated, but versed in issues of Black history, Black ancient history, so you don't fall for the okie doke. You see a bunch of videos, people reacting to Thomas Sowell, and like they feel like their mind has been blown, but they're just getting very bad, very faulty information, and because he likes to cherry pick. So I've said it several times. I'm just going to show it now. So this is from an excerpt from his book, Black Rednecks and White Liberals. So I'm going to debunk this entire video in another video. Right now, I'm going to deal with a specific piece that he cherry picks, and I'm going to demonstrate it, and I'm going to debunk it, and then we'll move on to the next video at another time. So here we go. Let's get it. I'm going to skip to about the 6-minute mark. Yeah.
Imply that there was unanimity within the West on this institution. In addition to whites who defended the enslavement of Africans on racial grounds, or who opposed general emancipation on social grounds, there were many whites, and even blacks, who defended slavery as a matter of self-interest as slave owners.
Yeah, that is true. That is true. And he's going to explain why. So this part, yes, correct.
Although most black owners of slaves in the United States were only nominal owners of members of their own families, there were thousands of other blacks in the antebellum South who were commercial slave owners, just like their white counterparts.
Okay, so we have to break it down piece by piece, right? Because people hear a whole 8-minute, 10-minute video without really thinking about it and doing the research right then and there. But that's why I'm here. That's why I'm here. So he said, I already confirmed that blacks defended enslavement, and you're going to see why, right? So he said that a portion of black people freed black people, enslaved other black people. So when people hear that, automatically they feel like their mind has been blown. They feel like they've been lied to all their life. But if you really listen to what was said, we'll actually go back.
Who were commercial slave owners. There were thousands of other blacks in the antebellum South who were commercial slave owners. Just thousands of states were only nominal owners of members of their own, although most black owners of slaves in the United States were only nominal owners of members of their own families.
Said nominal owners and members of their own family. So this is the part that I'm really gonna dig into. So he said most. Remember, he said most. Most freed black people owned other people, black people who were relatives and friends as well too. So the mode of enslavement wasn't the same for black people. Black people who became free during this time of antebellum were trying to get other black people free. But in order to do that, they had to get the paperwork, they had to get the certificates. So technically, on paper, they're a slave holder, like white people.
There were thousands of other blacks in the antebellum South who were commercial slave owners, just like their white counterparts.
Okay, so I'm not even disputing this, but let it continue on.
An estimated one-third of the free persons of color in New Orleans were slave owners, and thousands of these slave owners volunteered to fight for the Confederacy during the Civil War.
Here we go. So you heard that. So he picked one area, New Orleans. Let's put it back a little bit.
Third of the free persons, just like their white counterparts. An estimated one-third of the free persons of color in New Orleans were slave owners, and thousands of these slave owners volunteered to fight for the Confederacy during the Civil War.
So black slave owners who volunteered to fight in the Civil War. This is the representation that they're using. So instead of, well, they did mention, or Thomas Sowell did mention that most black people who enslaved other black people were doing it for family. So when you hear the notion that there's a large percentage of black people who enslaved other black people in the US, it's complete BS. It's BS because black people enslaved other black people in order to make them free. So technically, you can't even call it enslavement. It was really a path to freedom like they got for themselves. But like I said, the paperwork, you needed those papers to show that you were indeed a free person, or else you could be thrown back into enslavement. So all the money that was paid to be free might be in jeopardy without those papers, and those papers count towards the records of black, so quote unquote, black slaveholders. So that is the game that they try to play. That is the game that the conservatives and the Republicans will try and play and confuse black people because they don't know any better. They haven't done their research.
Black slave owners were even more common in the Caribbean during the Civil War.
And another thing, it's talking about black people fighting in the Confederacy, talking about a different level of anti-blackness at that time, just a different level. So one third in New Orleans wanted to keep commercial enslavement. Okay, and they fought in the Confederacy. And I really am not gonna even dispute that, but that was not the majority. That was not the majority.
Black slave owners were even more common in the Caribbean. In short, there were many defenders of slavery in the West, even in the 19th century.
So, like I said, I'm gonna debunk this entire video in another video, but I'm just gonna go through exactly how this idea of black slaveholders even came to be. We're gonna go piece by piece, very slowly, because Thomas Sowell, he throws out a lot of big words and information. He's definitely a good communicator. He's definitely a good way to trick white conservatives into thinking he's very intelligent and he knows what he's talking about when it comes to black people. But he's just a grift that they use and they continue to use. So we'll start here. We'll start with Exhibit A. As always, Library of Congress, loc.gov, not even a .com or .org, .gov, okay? The African American Odyssey, A Quest for Full Citizenship, right? Free blacks in the antebellum period, those years from formation of the Union until the Civil War, were quite outspoken about the injustice of slavery. Their ability to express themselves, however, was determined by whether they lived in the North or in the South. Free Southern blacks continued to live under the shadow of slavery, unable to travel or assemble as freely as those in the North. It was also more difficult for them to organize and sustain churches, schools, or fraternal orders, such as the Masons, fraternal orders. I'm I'm not even gonna get into a whole new rabbit hole. I'm just gonna let it sit there, okay? So, although their lives were circumscribed by numerous discriminatory laws, even in the colonial period, freed African Americans, especially in the North, were active participants in American society. Black men enlisted as soldiers and fought in the American Revolution and the War of 1812. Some owned land, homes, businesses, and paid taxes. In some northern cities, for brief periods of time, Black property owners voted. A very small number of free blacks owned slaves. The slaves that most free blacks purchased were relatives whom they later manumitted. A few free blacks also owned slaveholding plantations in Louisiana, Virginia, and South Carolina. So, a very small number owned slaves, and this within that number we have free blacks that purchased relatives, and they were later manumitted during the antebellum period, and some who had plantations. The number of enslaved in those plantations, it doesn't say, but it says here a very small number of free blacks owned slaves. A very small number. So, encyclopedia.com, Black slave owners. Despite the popularity of the novel The Known Worlds, the phenomenon of slaveholding among African Americans or Black people owning other Black people as slaves has not received widespread attention. However, historians and other scholars have discovered records of slaveholding among Blacks dating from the colonial period through the antebellum era. Such records include wills in which Black slave owners left slave property to family members or friends. Deeds of emancipation required when slave owners manumitted their slaves. Bills of sale recording the purchase and sale of slaves. Court records detailing suits disputing ownership of slave property. And personal papers referring to slave ownership. Some early historians saw free Black slave ownership as positive because it meant that free Blacks had the economic and legal ability to own slaves. In general, there were two categories of slaveholding by African Americans: benevolent and commercial. So let's look at this. This term benevolent slave ownership was actually trying to be transferred to European slaveholders. But this term benevolent slave ownership can only be applied to African Americans who were once slaves themselves. This benevolent slave ownership cannot be used for a European who was never a slave. That is the difference. Do not get it confused. Benevolent slave ownership. It did not mean that African Americans were buying slaves to whip them and to exploit them. Okay? For instance, benevolent slave ownership is characterized among African Americans, is characterized by purchase of relatives or friends. For instance, a free African woman might purchase her husband in order to remove him from the threat of cruel master, or a parent might purchase his or her children for the same reason, right? So we'll go to the next exhibit, because this is how you do research. You just shouldn't just listen to just anybody, just for any take that sounds good. You got to do your own research. This is journal.org, were African American slaveholders benevolent or exploitive? A quantitative approach. The ownership of African American slaves by other African Americans were surely one of the most peculiar features of the peculiar institution. Yet in the antebellum South, free black people did indeed own enslaved black people. So they're not disputing that. Why that was so has been a matter of dispute. Most historians have emphasized benevolence as the motivation for slaveholding by blacks, but others have emphasized exploitation. This paper seeks to contribute to that debate using a quantitative approach, drawing upon census data in order to investigate the extent to which the pattern of slaveholding by blacks was or was not similar to that of slaveholding whites. So clearly, there is a difference between a black slaveholder who just became free and a white slaveholder who was never a slave. That is the difference. And Republicans, conservatives will try and come in and make it seem like it's all the same. It's not all the same. This is clearly the nuance from being a slave, wanting to free other slaves by the same means that you were freed. The first scholar to make an intensive study of black slaveholders was Carter G. Woodson, the pioneering African American historian. In his 1924 book, Free Negro Owners of Slaves in the United States in 1830, Woodson wrote that most black slave owners acquired their slave property to preserve family ties. Woodson wrote that most black slave owners acquired their slave property to preserve family ties. For example, a husband who was born or had managed to become free might buy his wife from the white person who owned her. The husband would thereafter possess his spouse as a slave, not because he wished to keep her in bondage, but because the laws of the slave states often made manumission difficult or impossible. Thus, African Americans held their African Americans in a kind of pseudo slavery. African Americans held other African Americans in pseudo slavery rather than in genuine servitude, and the owner's motivation for possessing their slave property was benevolent rather than exploitive. Woodson did acknowledge that there were black slaveholders who bought slaves for the same reason that whites did, to gain economic advantage from their forced labor, but he believed that such exploitation of blacks by blacks was relatively rare. And this is just an excerpt. This is just an excerpt. So this is a whole journal, the Journal of Southern History. Okay? I'll probably see if I could even access this through academic means. But we're going to go on to the next one, right? So we're starting to build the picture and build the difference between the black slaveholder and the white slaveholder. Remember, white Republicans, conservatives, they want to confuse you into thinking that there's no nuance. They want you to think that the white slaveholders were the same as the freed black slaveholders. You see the cherry picking? They want to left out that those black slaveholders were freed and that they mainly purchased friends and family to free them as well. The reason why there's records is because you need to have papers, certificates to show that you are indeed free, or you could be thrown in jail or back into enslavement. Are you following me? Please tell me you're following me. Next one. Where are we at with this? We are in LSU libraries. .edu. .edu. Louisiana. No, is this? I think this is Louisiana. Library in Louisiana. We're gonna start here. This paragraph. Free people of color played an important role in Spain's New World Empire as soldiers, sailors, artisans, and laborers. Manumission, by which slaves were granted or purchased their freedom, had been customary in the Iberian Peninsula as far back as Roman times and was transplanted by the Spanish and Portuguese to their American colonies, giving rise to a large and vibrant population of free people of color. Right now, this population was not the majority, but this practice of manumission started with Spain and Portuguese. And if you know anything about the origins of enslavement and the beginning somewhere around the 15th century, 14, I can't get the exact number right now. It was the Spanish and the Portuguese that were the ones that kicked it off, the transatlantic slave trade. So obviously the practices that they already have, manumission, they brought it to the American colonies. But as it got more popular in America, there was laws passed to make it harder for manumission. Let's go on to the next one because I'm pretty sure everyone's following me so far. We could see exactly what's going on. Let's make this a little bit bigger. Here we go. So, buying freedom. So these are three examples of freedom being bought. Opportunities for most enslaved African Americans to attain freedom were few to none. Some were freed by their owners to honor a pledge, to grant a reward, or before the 1700s, to fulfill a servitude agreement. A few were bought by Quakers, Methodists, and religious activists for the sole purpose of freeing them, a practice soon banned in southern states. A practice by Quakers, Methodists, and religious activists for the sole purpose of freeing them. Many ran away to free territory, and some of these fugitives succeeded in avoiding capture and forced to the south. A rare option was self-purchase, the term itself revealing the base illogic of enslavement. In 1939, almost half, 42% of free blacks in Cincinnati, Ohio, had bought their freedom and were striving to create new lives while searching for and purchasing their own relatives. So, how many sources so far did I give you about black slaveholders? One, two, three, four, five. We are at five. We got two more. Two more. Okay. Okay. So we got another one. University of Pittsburgh. Look, .edu. Pay attention to the sources and what they use. .com, .ca, .org. Pay attention. Pay attention. Come down here. In some cases, African Americans participated in benign purchase and sale of family members and disregard the Freedom Papers of Julia Mason recorded by the county on October 1st, 1851, constitute an illuminating record. Mason was freed by her husband, Robert Mason, who purchased her from G.W. Baker of Winchester for the sum of $600. Since Robert Mason was a free African man, the document records a black person participated in the slave economy before the honorable purpose of freeing his wife from bondage. Oh my goodness. This document records a black person participated in the slave economy but for honorable purposes. So these records, you see, people like Thomas Sowell, this is why I say he cherry picks. So he looks at these records and he's like, oh, there's a sizable amount of black people. Well, he did say most. He said most black people did own slaves for relatives. Said that in the excerpt. But then he tried to slip in 1/3 of one state who fought in the Confederacy and try to make that seem like it was a big thing. Obviously, blacks fighting for the Confederacy, they're not going to be all the way in their head anyways. We should not be looking to them for examples because they're already defeated in the sense that they want to be under white people. I mean, let's just go to the final one. The final one here, okay? Where are we at? We are at mountvernon.org. Mountvernon.org. And we come down here. These are accounts of history. So, down here, many former Mount Vernon slaves and their children appear in these records. The entries reveal that some people who are emancipated in Washington's will were able to buy the freedom of enslaved family members owned by the Pastice estate. Sambo Anderson purchased and then freed his daughter Charity, his grandchildren William and Eliza, and Eliza's children James, William, and John. So let's take this example right here, right? One so-called black slaveholder, quote unquote, had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 technically slaves as a black slaveholder. And then all this information is put together, and then somewhere along the line, Thomas Sowell comes in and distorts it. And white conservatives and Republicans continue to distort it. Oh, a big number of black people owned slaves during that time as well too. So, I mean, that is it. What more can I say? What more can I really say? I'm going to be doing more videos on Thomas Sowell because there's a lot of information that needs to be, it needs to, not even information, his perception needs to be fully analyzed and fully debunked, to be honest. This is why I'm going to be debunking this video right here because there's more information I want to get into, but I didn't want to make this video too long, but I just wanted to show and demonstrate the nuances of enslavement. It wasn't all just black and white. See, that's the thing about conservatives. They want to make history simple. Oh, everybody had slaves back in the day, so nobody thought it was wrong. They want to make things simple for their audience because, to be honest, we could just have to keep it 100. Audience is not that intelligent. The number of people who read books have gone down drastically with the introduction of social media. People don't read books anymore. They're watching TikToks now, right? So when you have somebody who seems educated like Thomas Sowell, and you're not educated yourself, you haven't read the books yourself on ancient history, Black history, African history, it's easy to fall for somebody like a Thomas Sowell. But that's it for this video. I've done enough ranting. I've went through all the sources. Doubt. There's no doubt that there's nuance that needs to be looked at, but I'm going to get on to the next video. Thank you for listening. Let me know if there's any specific point about Thomas Sowell that you want me to debunk, and I'm going to look at it and I'm going to debunk it. If it's true, it's true. But this is the thing. You have to be able to sift through what Thomas Sowell says. I'm not saying everything Thomas Sowell says is a lie. But what I'm saying is he's going to zero in on specific facts to build a narrative that's only favorable to white conservatives, white Republicans, because he, in many ways, he is a pioneer of this culture war between the left and the right, because he talks about liberals in a disparaging way. But if you know me, you know I am nonpartisan. I think Democrats should go in the garbage. I think Republicans should go in the garbage. And I think Black people should be advocating for their own agenda and not the agenda of a political party. I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to leave it there. Like I said, if you got any ideas, any points, any videos that you want me to look at, I will look at it and I will do what I have to do. And I'm going to throw it in the debunk series with the other videos. Please check out my debunk series, right? Where I go through the information in real time and demonstrate. But that's enough for this one. Peace out to the next video. Thank you for listening.